Okay, so will you tell us who you are
I'm Thomas Christie.
and what role you play?
I play, my title, official title is I'm the school community multicultural administrator. I'm
Okay.
also the building principal here, and I'm the administrator over teammates at this point. This is my 39th year in education. I'll be starting my 40th
Oh,
in
wow.
August.
Wow.
And to be very upfront, I would not be here if it wasn't for Miss Leola Bullock.
Is that right? Can you tell
It's,
us about Leola and what she was like and what part she played for lots of things in Lincoln, but particularly maybe in women's issues?
it's, well, my understanding from knowing her, and I may refer to her as Mama Bullock because I was one of her children, as she would say. Um, when she first came from Mississippi, Lincoln was very segregated. And I ended up coming here in the early 60s, and it was still very segregated. There wasn't a lot of opportunities for people of color, specifically African Americans. It was separated in the sense that there was still what was called, referred to as T-Town. It was basically the only place that an African American could buy a home was in that area. They would not sell homes to African Americans outside of that. And during the 70s, and when she first came, there were a lot of places that were not hiring African Americans, as some of the stores, department stores. And my understanding is that she was one of the first persons to organize and you might say march against those stores, Goals and others who were not hiring at the times. And eventually they hired, and she was one of the persons that they hired because she came here looking for work. I think she had an associate degree when she came here from Mississippi, and so she came here under segregation, and she began to fight for that and began to meet other people. She was a collaborator with other women of color, but also progressive white women, because the women's movement was starting in the 70s, Title IX and all those kinds of things. So Mama Bullock was good at meeting people, and those who were progressive would team with her, and they started to start organizations. Myself and many others, when I say that I wouldn't be here without her, I was one of those kids at the time I had become a state ward. I came here to live with my sister. That didn't work out for me, so I ran away and became a state ward. And I was one of her children, her boy, as she said, and others too. But she worked with some of the more progressive whites like Y. Scott Moore, Shirley Marsh, who just passed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, help me, I'm sorry. You'll be able to edit this out.
Mm-hmm,
Names
absolutely.
are coming to me. Helen
Helen
Busales.
Busales.
Helen Busales. She worked with Judge Erbaum and his wife, and others. And there are many others. The names aren't coming. But they started an organization called the Destinaires and Les Cheremies. And it was primarily aimed at providing mentorship for African American students to encourage them to go to college. But they mentored them in order to do that. They worked at making sure our grades and encouraging us in some tutoring, but also etiquette, all kinds of things that many of us were not being exposed to. And the success rate is unbelievable. We would have a banquet every year at the Cornhusker Hotel, and later you can get a picture of two of those that are up there now, that was my senior year with Dr. Marilyn Johnson Farr, who's a professor at the university, not at the university, she's a professor at Down College. And we were classmates. We went to Wesleyan. There were several of us went to Wesleyan. Part of that was Shirley Marsh and others who were connected to the Methodist Church, and also the former mayor, Helen Busalis, and the mayor after her, Colleen Sang, thank you. Colleen, forgive me. And so, again, emphasizing that collaboration. And they basically made connections for us in the community, found scholarships, supported us, encouraged us. You couldn't go to the banquet unless your grades were up, and so forth. We had a king and queen. If you couldn't afford a tux or a dress, they found ways that you got it. I remember there were times I didn't have it, but I ended up with a tuxedo anyway. And you know, I look back on that. And when I got to Wesleyan, as you know, it wasn't cheap. But Pell Grants had came in at that time, and so it could be used. At first, it was for public schools, but they extended it to private as well, and so I ended up getting stuff. But I was always short, and I would go into the admission, and they would tell me, well, I would get these notes about tuition that I was short, and I would say, I got work study, I'm playing football, I don't have no more time. They said, don't worry about it, somebody took care of it. Every semester, don't worry about it, somebody took care. I look back on that after 4 years, it probably was, you know, over $3,000 to $5,000 that I know where it came from. Her and her collaborations and the Destinaires and Sheremies, and that's what I mean by I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. She also got really involved in education. She wanted to make sure there was an equitable education for women, for any group that was disenfranchised. Again, Ms. Bullock will tell you though that, you know, being of African American descent, that was a major emphasis, but it was not the only. She did not exclude anyone, but she saw that as a great need because of the experiences she had in Mississippi as well as when she came here. And so, because of her work efforts, this office exists. She walked into the former director of curriculum, Neil Cross, when her daughter was at Northeast High School. She had a history book, laid it down and said, show me where my daughter is in this book. And Neil started looking through the book and he said, not too many places here. And she said, not only are African Americans not much in here, neither women and others, and I need you to do something about that. But along with Paul Olson and others, they had started this group. It's called Triple T, which helped former, especially women, and primarily women, but there was some men, but who did not have a teaching degree. They worked to try to increase the number of teachers of color, and some of those who went through was like Ada Robertson, was one who went through the Triple T and got their education degrees and got teaching jobs and so forth. So she spent a lot of time working on education and speaking about education and really emphasizing that to the point that a law eventually was passed. But because of her efforts, there's an award that we give every year called the Leola Bullock Award. And it's for those educators who go beyond their extensive work duty already, but to do those kinds of things are advocating for those who are disfranchised, but also those who make sure that they try to infuse in their curriculum as well. They used to do a lot of that, but because of the efforts, now it's becoming almost institutionalized. The kinds of things that they would sit down and go through books. Now when there's a book review, it's automatically done, and it's done by staff, and it's just part of how we do business now, which is because of her efforts and others. There was a committee that was started called the Multicultural Advisory Committee in 1972. It still exists today. That advisory committee does. This position was created eventually because of her efforts in education. So that was an area that she was very involved in. She was also involved in city and state politics. A former student of mine, a Lincoln High grad, Dr. Johnson, who she teaches in a historical black college. I think it's a females college in North Carolina now. But she wrote the memoirs of Senator Chambers and a book called I can't think of the name of the book, but it's something about it's basically of his life as a politician. And in that book are several pictures of Mama Bullock. And because Senator Chambers, she collaborated with him on some of the efforts, including this law that him and again her collaboration. A history teacher out of Norfolk, Nebraska. So her efforts spread across the state. Jim Cubitt was his name. He was a history teacher who proposed the law. His students, he started doing some of this stuff that was advocated about more infusion of the history, culture, and contributions of disenfranchised, people of color included in the curriculum. And he started teaching this stuff in Norfolk, and eventually his students said, why don't we know this stuff? Every student should know this, etc. And to make a long story short, they proposed to write a law, and they did. And they got Senator Dan Schmidt, and Senator Chambers to introduce this law. People said it wouldn't pass, but you don't tell Senator Chambers or Dan Schmidt that something's not going to pass. They were wrong. Not only did it pass, but now it's part of Rule 10, which is the rule that guides how schools, in order to keep their accreditation, there are various rules, and all school districts in the state of Nebraska are supposed to have a multicultural plan. And so she's left that legacy from that standpoint. She also spent a major part of her life fighting against the death penalty. She saw it as injustice all the way to the last day. I was with her the night before she passed, before she went into surgery. She passed. She never came out. She came out of surgery, but she never came through. And I was with her the night before. And that day, she had been down to a meeting, the Mayor's Multicultural Advisory Committee. She had been there to testify there, and then she went to the hospital that night. So the last day that she was conscious, she was advocating all the way to the end. She also was involved in faith-based organizations, because she saw injustice there as well towards women and people of color, and that she saw that there was a lot of civil rights work that needed to be done in those departments, in the education department. Excuse me. I need to plug this in. I'm going to lose my data.
You bet.
I'll be able to edit this out.
Absolutely.
Okay. Very quick. And so she got involved in speaking to faith-based organizations about that they need to be more sensitive towards women and justice, and that how important that was. So she also was involved in housing discrimination. She was constantly involved with the city and on their policies, and she was involved in the Urban League and Malone Center, and making sure that they were staying on task. Also in campaigns, she worked with those people who ran for office. She wanted to make sure she tried to support those that she felt was about justice for women and other disenfranchised people. So, I mean, she spent her entire life. That was her life. Was about that. Didn't have a lot, but she contributed what she had, time and limited resources. She would give to campaigns and so forth. So she lived a life of fighting for justice.
Great, wonderful. That was fantastic. Excellent, absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. I remember so many things about her, but I didn't think about the faith-based stuff. I hadn't thought that through because that
She
was
took 'em
really
on.
true. Yeah, she did. Yeah, she did. When we interviewed
Did anyone talk about Miss Shanks?
well, we don't have anybody that's talked specifically about
So I have a
Mrs.
few
Shanks.
comments.
You
Oh,
do?
that'd be
Okay,
great.
that'd be great. When I talked to Charlene Maxey Harris, it was interesting because you mentioned the part about not being able to get work downtown. And she mentioned that Joanne Maxey ended up having to work, that she was able to finally get a job down in, what was Miller and Payne, I think, at the time. And that was a big push that they made to be able to work downtown.
Right.
And Joanne, of course, had hoped to work other places, but that was the kind of work she could get, and so she did. So it was interesting to hear that. And Bernice Onaha talked a little bit about that too. Yeah, because Bernice also did that. Yeah, if you can talk a little bit about Lela, that would be great. We're trying to get an interview with Sheila, but we haven't gotten there yet.
She's here.
I know, I don't know. I'm having trouble connecting with her, but
You know where she works.
no.
That's why. She has a big time job with the Bar Association.
Oh.
Yeah, that'd keep you busy.
Okay.
But that's how you would get a hold of her.
Yeah, that's a good
And,
point.
and she living in her parents' house
Oh, really?
on
Because
Randolph. She bought.
I tried to contact her through the law college and I wasn't able to find her, so I'll
Try
try
the
the bar association,
she
that's a
works with
good
the Bar
thing, but if
Association.
you wanna say a couple things about Lela, that would be great.
Sure, I'll
Okay,
try to.
great, why don't you just
Okay.
go ahead and roll?
Well, one of Miss Bullock's best friends was Miss Lela Shanks, and Miss Shanks and Miss Bullock, they were best of friends, but their approaches were a little different. Miss Shanks came here also out of the Kansas City area, and she had homeschooled her kids before her older kids because of segregation and disenfranchisement as well. And her and her husband Hugh Shanks, they had experienced some discrimination, and so they moved here. And when they moved here, they had trouble finding housing. And there were some people, again, some collaboration. Someone who just passed, Carol Smith, that wasn't her maiden name, but she had worked with Miss Shanks to make sure, because she knew some connections. Her husband at the time was a lawyer, and she eventually divorced, but her husband was a lawyer in town, and it helped Miss Shanks and her husband find a house. Now that may not seem like a big deal, but at the time they bought a house on Randolph, and at that time it was people of color could not find a house south of O Street, and so it was like that, and so she came here and getting in that struggle, and then eventually met Miss Bullock, and they became as a couple. They did things together and began to collaborate, and etc. And Miss Shanks was one of those persons who also got involved in education. She was a former journalist. She had a journalism degree, so she wrote a lot and articulated through writing her story and her. And eventually, she ended up taking care of Hugh, her husband, Hughes, and she wrote a book and lectured at the Mayo Clinic about caregiving for persons with Alzheimer's, which was huge. But I had her speak a lot and do some things. But she was part of the speaking bureau for the state, and she would go all around the state speaking about education. And she was really an emphasizer of the unity of all people, and she questioned anyone who questioned the humanity of anybody. And it reminded me of a famous saying that someone who just passed, Maya Angelou, remind me of, the Roman thing that she got from Terence in Rome. I am a man, but I am a woman, I guess you would say, and I consider nothing that is human is alien to me. And that was pretty much what Miss Shanks, that was the walk she made. I remember her telling me and said, "Did you read this research?" And she had ran into this guy who was a scientist, and they had met, and she wanted to make sure I had this, and I've used it ever since and looked it up. But it was the research on DNA, that 99.2% of all human beings' DNA are exactly the same. And that was her premise on almost everything she did the last 10 or so years of her life was about that. But she was a strong advocate of education. Also got involved some in politics, and just the whole, very involved in the death penalty as well, anti-death penalty. So.
Yeah, I know. I heard her speak several times, and the book, Your Name is Hughes.
Right.
Yeah, I love that. It's so good.
It's powerful.
Yeah, it's very powerful. She was a very powerful speaker too.
Yes.
Yeah, very much so. Do you mind if Elizabeth takes a picture of
Sure.
some of your pictures? Yeah.
Sure.
The other thing is, okay, and this is going to be a bit of
That's Johansi, as you know.
Yeah,
With-
exactly.
Yeah.
I know.
That was when he got his law degree.
That's
Yeah.
so awesome.
So
That's great.
that was at the Elite Center. That's where they had the Goodness.
So this is going to be a funny question because it's going to be asking you kind of almost to channel these two women. But one of the questions that we asked, that Kathy asked of the other women being interviewed was, if they were to speak to young women today, what would their charge be, or what advice would they give, or what would they say to young women today?
Well, based on, both of these women had tremendous impact on my life. And as I look back, I don't know anyone else who had probably as strong an impact on my life. Now, some of the people they collaborated with, when I see George Urban, my heart warms up, but it all goes back to their connection. Mr. William Bogart, you didn't know him, but he was the principal. She know who he was of Lincoln High School. Because of Miss Bullock, he took me in his car and took me to Westland and said, "Give this kid a chance." Back to their connection. I say that premise is because what I would say, based on what I know of these two women, I would say to young women that never limit yourself. If you have a dream, work at it. You can make it happen. And that reach out and collaborate. Learn to be cross-cultural. And don't limit yourself.